Welcome back, friends! This is the second lesson in my free Figma course for complete beginners. And in this lesson we are going to cover the differences between groups, frames, auto layouts and selection. This topic is very important because this is something you are going to be using every time you're working in Figma, and that will help you to organize your Figma file, to collaborate with others and to understand what others are doing in their files. At the same time, those entities have a lot of similarities and can be used interchangeably in many scenarios. But if you use them wrongly, you can easily overcomplicate your file and make it a nightmare for others to work with your Figma designs. Also, before we start, in the previous lesson I did the overview of the Figma interface. I touched upon usage of frames and selections already, and if you are not familiar with Figma yet and you have never opened it, I highly recommend you to start with the first video of this course. With that being said, let's get into Figma. And the first tool that you can use in Figma and we're going to discuss is groups. The grouping is actually pretty easy to understand, and it's also the simplest form of object organization in the file. So let's create some objects first. I'm going to use this bottom panel to create some random objects, and if you do not know how to use this panel, I refer to you to the first video in this course. It's very simple. I'm just going to create a rectangle and a circle, for example. So now I have two objects in my file. If I envision that those objects, they are connected and they should always be together in the file and they are not allowed to be separated, then what I can do is I can group them. The easiest way to do that is to use the shortcut Command-G, or just by tapping with two fingers on your touchpad and triggering this menu. If you use a classical mouse, then you need to right click on it and then just click on the group selection. This is it. Now you have your group created, and what you can do with it is that you can move it around together and it will become unbreakable. You can also apply certain settings on the group and it will be applied to both objects. There are not so many settings to discuss, but you can apply transparency to the group, or you can create a stroke around all objects, or you can also apply certain effects like drop shadow or layer blur if you wanted. And that will be pretty much it in terms of what you can do with your group. You can also export this group all together, and when you export it, you will have both objects on your picture. So for example, in this PNG file, I will not have a background, but I will have both objects there. And this is pretty much it. You can also ungroup the objects back by clicking Command-Shift-G, or also through the drop-down menu. And also, as you can see, some effects that I applied to this group, they disappeared, but some stayed. For example, the stroke. This is a bit of an unpredictable part of Figma, to be honest, but you will get used to it. Just be aware that some effects, they apply to the group and you cannot inherit them to the objects if you ungroup it. Now, the other thing to understand about the group, let's group it together again, is when you move the group around, everything works fine. But if you will decide to change the size of the group, you will change the size of all of the objects in it. That might be very convenient if that was your intention, but if you want to set up a certain behavior for objects inside of the group, say they should stay in place and be aligned to the left-hand side corner when you enlarge the group, you cannot do so with the grouping. Let's imagine that you have a screen for a certain device, for mobile device, and those objects, they are not a rectangle and a circle, but they are icons, and you want them to be exactly 16 to 16 pixels. You don't want to enlarge them because that is not compliant with your design system, for example. Now, you might also want for your objects to be responsive as well, meaning that when the device screen size enlarge, those objects, they behave in a certain way. For example, a rectangle object will stay on the left hand side and a circle will stay on the right hand side, and they will just move independently from each other. But you might still want them to be grouped because this is your menu item, for example. So unfortunately, inside of the group you cannot do that, because if you enlarge the group, this is what will happen. The objects inside of it will distort proportionally. But there is a workaround in Figma, and there is another entity or another tool that you can use for it. And this tool is called frame. Actually, we already have a frame inside of our file. And also we have touched on what the frame is when we were discussing the Figma's interface. But let's discuss it one more time. First of all, the frame is the major thing you're going to use in your designs. You're going to work with them all the time. And what frame does when you're creating it, it allows you to choose the screen size, the exact screen of a device you're creating your designs for. And there is a good reason for that, of course. We're designing for devices and they have the limited size of the screen. So this is the first usage of the frame. This is the first function. Let's create a design for an iPhone. Now we have a frame in place that is exactly aligned with the physical size of the screen for an iPhone. But if you place anything inside of the frame that goes beyond the frame, it will not be visible on your iPhone. So this we have already discussed. You can also make it visible. One more time, I will explain it by clicking clip content, and then this rule will go and you will able to see what you have there hidden, but you will only be able to see that in your Figma, not of course in your actual iPhone, because you cannot enlarge the size of an iPhone. I think this is pretty clear. But in a context of our discussion today, it's important to note that frames have a different function. And this function is similar to grouping. So you can turn your group into a frame as well. And you can do that by right-clicking and choosing frame selection in the menu group, or just by using the given shortcut. Now you have it, and your group is now wrapped up in a frame. This is actually in many situations is not convenient that you have right now these levels of complexity. So I usually recommend ungrouping the objects that you have inside of a frame, unless you have an idea to have their multiple groups that should belong together. But in our case, we don't need the group inside of a frame, so I will basically ungroup it right now. Now, what is the difference then between a group and a frame? The major difference is that you can have more settings inside of the frame for your objects to make them responsive. Let's actually review what will happen if you decide to enlarge your frame. If you increase the size of a frame, you immediately see that the objects there, they stayed in place. Unlike a group where all group is sizing, you are only sizing up and down your frame. And this is especially important in the context of responsiveness, because you might have an idea that your objects inside of the frame, they are again icons, for example, and they belong to a menu. Let's imagine that this is a burger icon and this is a search icon, for example. So you want them to be placed on the top of the screen, and you want them to be always aligned to the corners. And if you will enlarge the size of the screen, for example, instead of an iPhone Pro Max, you want to create a screen for an iPhone SE. And you don't want to redesign them all and reposition all of the objects. You can do so inside of a frame. And this is how you do that. You choose an object inside of the frame, and now you have more settings that you can apply to your object. And those settings, they are not only about the appearance, but also about the position. This piece here on the right-hand side corner is called constraints. And those constraints, they define the placement of an object inside of your frame. So let's imagine I want this rectangle to be always aligned to the left and the circle to the right. Then I will need to define the constraints for this circle by clicking here on the right-hand side. Now, what will happen, especially if we move it to the right, is that when I will be changing the size of the group, this is how they will behave right now. They have a predefined position right now inside of a frame, which is very convenient for the use cases I mentioned with responsiveness. And another fantastic part is that you can actually adjust the constraints for the frame itself when it is positioned inside of another frame. So we have a frame for an iPhone 16 Pro Max, and now this frame can also be defined through the constraints, and I might want to decide and stretch it when the size of the iPhone Pro Max screen changes. But if you will just click on the right hand side dash here, nothing will happen from what you expect. The frame will just be aligned to the right, and this is not what you want. You want it to be stretched. So how can you do that? Is actually not so obvious. You need to hold the shift. And when you do that and click to this dash, then you will have them both selected, and that means that right now your frame will stretch together with the objects inside of this frame, which is fantastic. It saves a lot of time while designing because we often design for multiple screen sizes. So I highly recommend you to look at these constraints in your spare time. You will understand them in no time. They are pretty obvious if you remember to hold the shift, and then you will be using them all the time while designing. But just for a quick overview, what it also does is that I can also define this frame to be placed in the center of the screen. And if I click those dashes in the center, it will now be aligned with the center of the screen, which is also very convenient and useful. If you want it to be aligned to the top, you can do so, but then it will behave differently. So there is a lot of room for you to play. And next up is auto layouts. Auto layouts are actually pretty complex. There's going to be another video on how auto layouts work, because there are a lot to this topic. You can do a lot of things, but in the context of our discussion, we shall see how we can group objects alternatively. And auto layouts is just another possibility. So let's have an example that might be a bit more realistic. We now don't have just abstract objects, but let's imagine that we, in our designs, we will have some repeating pieces. Maybe we will have a list like that. We can of course group the list, we can create a frame, but then every time we will have to add an item, we will have to manually position it, which is not convenient if you are working with a very high loaded screen. So what you can do for the situation like that is that you can use an auto layout. You can click it here, and this is where you will trigger the auto layout. The right click menu panel is also working. It also has this option, and also you can use the shortcut Command A. And now you can notice that the space between objects has become similar. And moreover, you can now increase the spacing by just dragging it here. And again, that saves us so much time because we don't have to define the space manually anymore. But what is even more fantastic is that if I need to add a new object to this list, I can just copy and paste it or duplicate it or just drag and drop it to the list. So you will see that it is actually very intuitive to work with it. And this is again a huge time saver. The life was very much complicated when we did not have this feature. Now this feature is absolutely fantastic, but it will require us to have another lesson because there are a lot of things you can do with your auto layout, and there are some strategies you can use on how to organize them. So let's have a deep dive in some other lessons. By the way, an auto layout is just a form of a frame. So you can see here in the layers, we still have it named frame. And this is because this is nothing different. You can also use the constraints, which is fantastic, and they will now be dependent on the size of your original frame. I hope you can see how many possibilities it opens for you, because it really does. Feel free to play around with auto layouts, it's really fun, or wait until the next lesson. By the way, if you like this tutorial and you don't want to miss new ones, then click the bell down below and you will get a notification when a new lesson comes out. Now, the last thing that we need to cover in this lesson, because it's another type to group objects, is the selection. And the selection is a very new tool in Figma, and it comes to us from the FigJam. FigJam is a completely different format in Figma that you can create. We have it discussed in the first lesson of the course. Right now, I'm not going to stop on it because selection is actually pretty easy. You can click down here, choose the selection. There is also a shortcut for it, but I'm not using it that often, so I don't know the shortcut, to be honest. And actually what selection does, it helps you to group frames inside of your Figma file. I do not recommend using selection for creating designs, because you cannot then use the selection to create a prototype. You can just see it as the way to help you organize your Figma file for you internally. So please don't group the objects inside of the frame by using a selection tool. It will just not be visible. But if you're working on a file that has become really big, you can then use the selection to specify what is in progress and what is ready for review, for example. like that. And now a final note on groupings in Figma. It is very easy to make your file overcomplicated by using a lot of auto layouts. There is often a situation when we work with files of others, and then it is not really convenient to work with them when there is an auto layout inside of an auto layout inside of an auto layout, because then you will have to click them all and see what do they actually define. And in this setup, it will also easier for you to break things inside of one auto layout that then will be inherited by all other auto layouts on the top. So I recommend you being really selective about what you wrap in an auto layout. My rule of thumb is that I start with the simplest grouping option, which is the group itself. And only when I need a group to be defined in a place or to be stretching, or I will need to have multiple objects of the same type, only then I upgrade. We can always go up in complexity, but going down might be more complex. And that was it for today. I hope you now know how to group objects inside of your Figma file. Let me know in the comments if anything is unclear. And if you want to continue learning Figma and you don't want to miss next tutorials, then hit the subscribe button down below and click the bell. This way you will get a notification when a new lesson comes out. And I see you in the next lesson.